Gentlemen, the table's yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for allowing us to present to you today a very, very emotional issue, an issue that is very important to, I'm sure, all the stakeholders in the room today. And I want to thank the committee for their work and for allowing us to present. And Senator Claitor, I want to personally thank you for your commitment in working with me for the past 3 years on this very important issue. And I know that the tireless work that you've done has been very well noted by me and many. If I can just open with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, and it says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That only happens when people like you put their hands on the arc and move it toward justice. We have to find a way to move that arc." Having said that, it's pretty profound that our union and our founders, when they founded this country, the preamble was, "We the people, in order to have a more perfect union, must establish union, justice, and confidence." Having served in the military, having served in law enforcement for most of my adult life, I realized that this is the greatest country in the world, but it's not perfect. And I'm sure all of us are in pursuit of that perfect union and justice be served. We know that this piece of legislation is very important. And I've, for one, will confess that I've evolved to the position that I am today. I was a proponent at one particular time, but once the facts are so glaring to us, and once I've grown spiritually, I realized that if I'm going to protect life, it has to be throughout. I think killing is horrible. I think it's horrific. I think it's making our communities in a posture where it's more the norm than the abnorm. But I think killing, whether it's on the streets of our community, which is touch almost every community in this state, is wrong. And I also think that government-sanctioned killing is wrong. People will say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But we all know that as long as the human element is involved in our justice systems, there's room for error. Some will argue today about the economic impact. Some will argue about the injustices based on moral convictions, on spiritual convictions. I just fundamentally think that killing is wrong. There is going to be a lot of testimony today about emotional issues, but I think it's worth saying that this bill does not retry any person that's on death row. It doesn't go back and release those individuals. This is perspective and going forward. Those cases that have been adjudicated through the courts and through the Supreme Court will stand. This does nothing to interfere with that process. So having said that, again, I respect those people whose opinions differ from mine, and I just ask that they respect our opinion on this very, very important issue. I believe that the death penalty is morally wrong. Killing of a human being is morally wrong. I also believe that our system is driven sometimes by overzealous police officers, overzealous prosecutors, political pressure, and sometimes we get it wrong. And I ask you today to look deep into your hearts, into your soul, and is it worth putting an innocent people to death, a person to death, for a crime that did not commit? Our communities now are no safer. They're not safe because of the death penalty. And all we have to do is look at the statistics. Again, Mr. Chairman and members, thank you. And again, it's an honor to sit here today with Senator Morrell, who I'm sure will give you his views. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Morrell. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today about this very important issue. I began my career in the legal profession as a public defender. And I can tell you from my limited time there before I was elected to the legislature, one thing you notice, and it's the nature of kind of why our founding fathers were so bullish on the idea of justice, is that when you balance the resources of the state versus the individual, there is inherently an inequity. The resources of the state to convict someone are infinite in comparison to the resources of an individual to defend themselves. And the reason why there are so many safeguards throughout the criminal justice system to provide for justice is that if the state decides to convict someone, more likely than not they will succeed due to the infinite discrepancy in resources. That being said, it is unequivocal and undisputed that we have people that were on death row that were found innocent and taken off of death row. That is not a contested fact. That has actually happened throughout the country and in Louisiana. So think about that for a second. That is not, people come up there and say, it's hypothetical that we execute an innocent person. Oh no, we've almost executed innocent people on numerous occasions, but for the intervention of groups that have come out, provided additional resources that person did not have, or technology got to a point that person could be exonerated from that crime. So if you follow that thread of logic, think about that for a second. But for the intervention, and almost in a lot of ways divine intervention due to timing, an innocent person would have been killed. Now, that being said, in how many instances did that outside intervention not manifest itself to prevent an innocent person from being killed? Ladies and gentlemen, I know many of you on this committee, I know many of us in the Capitol, we've all been to the prisons across this state. We've all been to Angola. And I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding that life in prison is a miserable existence. It is a miserable, awful existence, and it is not a punishment taken lightly, because when you convict someone and put them in prison for life, that life, for all practical purposes, ceases to move. You kind of get trapped in a hellish amber in North Louisiana and Angola, where you are toiling and remembering the awful things you've done, both personally and at the hands of your fellow inmates, depending on the deed you did, as many of you know. That being said, if government makes a mistake, despite the years that are lost to that individual who's toiling away at Angola or wherever else, and the horror that is prison, we can still correct it. And I mean, I sometimes know that there's false equivalencies, but whenever I hear someone say, and hopefully I won't hear it today, that that's just what happens. Sometimes you get the wrong person. It's like, that should never be acceptable in a society that is based upon justice. There is a reason why all modern first world countries have moved away from the death penalty. It's not because they're soft on crime. It's not because they don't think prisoners who've done horrific things deserve punishment. It's because they have made the determination that government is not infallible. And in order for the death penalty to even begin to be considered as a functional outreach of what government should do, you have to start from the position that you believe government is infallible. Now, all of us who work in this building know on a very basic, primal basis, government is not infallible. I think anyone who's watching television right now, looking at Congress or looking at us, is going, government is definitely not infallible. And if you do not hold that government gets it right every single time, then death should not be on the table. I know Terry already used a quote, but there's another quote that I saw that I think is really pertinent, and it was it really inspired me. Many of you know J.R.R. Tolkien. He's the guy that wrote Lord of the Rings. He's also a very prominent Christian philosopher. And he said, many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment. That is what the death penalty is. It is man dealing out death in judgment, and man is not infallible. God is infallible. If God decides to take someone, we take comfort when we lose a loved one saying, well, that was God's will, because God is infallible. We as men are not infallible. And that judgment to take someone's life should be reserved to the only infallible person to make that determination. So not to come full circle, but the issue is on the table, gentlemen. In order for you to believe the death penalty is something that's appropriate, you have to hold the position that government doesn't get it wrong. And if you don't believe government, and we all believe, honestly, I think government gets it wrong plenty of the time, it's very hard, if impossible, to support the death penalty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Representative Landry. Thank you, Representative J.P. Morrell. We're going to excuse you, gentlemen. I know you have other duties. Thank you for appearing. Gentlemen, Terry, JP, just for 1 second, if you return to the table, we're going to entertain a amendment by Senator Carter. Senator Carter, what's your amendment?
Before you guys leave, I want to. I've got an amendment that's prepared that you should have by now, or hopefully it'll pass out to you. In order to have maximum participation, if this is going to be a constitutional amendment, I think to ensure maximum participation, it's probably best to have this on the ballot with the presidential election. So I'd ask your indulgence in amending this from 2020 to 2021.
I think, Senator Carter, that's wholly appropriate. I think that this is an issue of tremendous importance to all the citizens of Louisiana. And obviously, the maximum turnout in any cycle is a presidential cycle. And whether you support the death penalty or oppose it, the idea is that you want your supporters to go cast their vote. And I think that that's the most appropriate way to deal with this, is putting it on presidential cycle, so everybody who wants to weigh in on this will have the opportunity to do so. Plus, it'll give both sides a lot of lead time for education, both for and against the position, as it's such an important issue of the state of Louisiana.
And just like the minimum wage constitutional amendment, whether you agree with it or not, if the electorate votes for us to come to Baton Rouge and vote for them, the least we can do is allow them the same right to vote for or against whether it's death penalty or any other constitutional amendment that will be on the ballot, particularly in my case, as you know, the importance that I've argued for many years, as you have supported many others, increasing our minimum wage. So I think this amendment will maximize our participation for this particular piece.
Okay.
All right. Well, I do want to stay on this particular bill, but do appreciate what you're saying. We've waited for a long time to move forward on this. As the author of the bill, along with these gentlemen, I'll accept the amendment and ask the committee to accept the amendment as well. I see no further questions on the amendment. Senator Carter has offered Amendment 1256. Is there any objection to the amendment? Seeing no objection to the amendment's accepted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members.
All right. Next up, we'll have Mr. Tasman, and he's going to take a little bit of time to get there. He's recovering from some injuries. And Mr. Nicholas Mitchell has also indicated that he'd like to speak if he would come forward. Okay. So amongst yourself, just choose whoever goes first, introduce yourself, and tell us what you have to say.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Rob Tasman with the Louisiana Conference of Catholic Bishops. We appreciate the opportunity to be here again today, as we have for the past 2 years, supporting a repeal of the death penalty. And what I wanted to do this morning was just sort of lay out the case from our particular faith tradition of why that is what it is. There are some misconceptions out there that I think are worth clearing up, and hopefully my comments will do that. First and foremost, as was mentioned in some of the comments previously, there is a true belief, and I think a recognition, as St. Pope John Paul II had mentioned, that today we live more in a culture of death than in a culture of life. And we believe, amongst our faith tradition and teaching, that the death penalty represents this culture of death. We don't think that the taking of a life actually solves a problem. Instead, it forces us further into this culture of death. And that culture can be seen in so many ways. So we need to try as best as we can and in all possible ways to promote a culture of life and to live that out within our society. A major teaching within the Catholic Church is also a foundational theme of Catholic social teaching, which is the life and dignity of the human person. We are called to uphold the dignity of all, a dignity that does not discriminate between the innocent and the guilty. In fact, we're called to make sure that in every way we do not take away the dignity of anyone, because dignity is given only by God and is given freely to every created individual. Pope Francis has stated clearly that the death penalty also purports the fallacy of justice. The death penalty does not render justice to victims. It obligates the state to kill in the name of justice, and justice can never be wrought by killing a human being. The bishops in the Catholic Church obviously and very sincerely recognize the pain of the family members of victims that's associated with the many heinous crimes that lead to the sentencing of the death penalty to the perpetrators. And the support of the bishops is always with the family members of the victims to do whatever it can to counsel, to provide pastoral help, to provide compassion and understanding. And in this way, the bishop's support of a repeal does not diminish the pain of those family members of victims. Instead, it truly affirms the life of their family members because it in itself affirms life itself. The teaching of the Church has been the center of a lot of attention, specifically with regard to the Catechism. And the Catechism reads, "If, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means. Today, the cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent." Pope Francis just recently added that because of this, the death penalty is inadmissible. Inadmissible, of course, is usually a legal term of art, and it means not accepted as valid. It's inadmissible with regard to the Catholic perspective because it offends the dignity of the human person without promoting the common good. And the death penalty is inadmissible because we have an alternative in this state with our advanced criminal justice system of being the sentencing of life without parole. That is the way to prevent more death, more violence to society, and to shield the aggressor from our communities. One other thought to share with you all, and that's the thought of the very important topic of salvation. St. Pope John Paul II stated that not even a murderer loses his personal dignity, as God himself pledges to guarantee this. For this reason, whoever attacks life in some ways attacks God himself. We must recognize the redemptive nature of the soul. When we execute an individual, we strip that person of the opportunity to repent, to be reconciled, and to renew their relationship with their Creator. We put ourselves as flawed human beings, in that place in which God alone stands. This should make us, at the very least, nothing less than uncomfortable. I'll share with you that I had the great opportunity and privilege to accompany our now Bishop Emeritus of Baton Rouge, Robert Munch, on his final trip to death row in Angola last year before his retirement. I had never been to death row, although I had been to Angola many times before. And I'll share with you one brief exchange. I have no idea of the words that were said. It probably lasted only about 5 minutes. But Bishop Munch reached through the bars of a cell on death row to the youngest inmate who sits on death row. And that inmate, when the exchange started, had a very hardened face and expression. Didn't even seem to want to be bothered by any kind of conversation with the bishop. And as the bishop walked away, that same inmate was in uncontrollable sobs and tears. Why? I don't have the answer. What was said? I have no idea of the words. That was a private exchange between Bishop Munch and the inmate. But it highlights at the very least that there is the possibility of redemption among all. The bishops of this state stand united in its support of a repeal and its opposition to the death penalty. This is not about a rogue bishop or anybody standing out against another. This is unity in the teaching of the church and in the faith. My colleagues across the country are fighting the same kind of bills all throughout the states, supporting repeals and standing against different ways to execute and different means that are being promoted. We do this because this is also supported by the church in the United States through the USCCB, and furthermore, through the Church Universal and the Church International. The teaching doesn't change. There is no division. There is only unity in support of a repeal. I leave you with this today. We are an Easter people. On Holy Thursday, we had a betrayal. On Good Friday, we had an execution. On Easter Sunday, we had a resurrection. You cannot take one without the other. They all go holistically together. And they teach us this: light will drown out darkness, and life will always prevail over death. For this reason, we ask your support of the bill before you, and in general, of a repeal so that Louisiana can be a consistently pro-life state. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tasman. Dr. Mitchell?
Good morning, Chair. My name is Dr. Nicholas Mitchell. I am a policy and research fellow specializing in race and racism at the Jesuit Social Research Institute at Loyola University, New Orleans. I support abolishing capital punishment because the death penalty is unjustifiable public policy. My opposition is based on two concerns. First, in order for the death penalty to be remotely justifiable, the criminal justice system would have to guarantee that no innocent person would be sentenced to death and executed. The criminal justice system can make no such guarantee. According to a 2016 article published in the Southern University Law Center's Journal of Race, Gender, and Poverty, from 1976 to 2015, out of 155 resolved death sentence cases in Louisiana, 127 were reversed, which includes 9 exonerations and 28 executions. At the time this article was published in April 2016, 9 people had been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death by the state since 1976. That number now stands at 11. It is an exercise in the most grotesque form of public policy negligence to continue this practice in light of a criminal justice system that cannot guarantee that an innocent person will not be put to death. There is no acceptable margin of error in this regard. There is no acceptable rate of executing innocent people other than 0. Second, sentencing and the application of the death penalty in Louisiana is quantifiably skewed racially. The last white person in Louisiana to be executed when the victim was black was a soldier found guilty of stabbing 2 enslaved black women with a bayonet in 1752, which predates the French and Indian War. The data presented in the aforementioned article shows that between 1976 and 2015, the capital punishment rate for cases involving a black male perpetrator when the victim was a black male was 0.52%. It was 1.44% when the victim was a black female. It was 4.27% when the victim was a white male, and it was 15.56% when the victim was a white female. Comparatively, the capital punishment rate for cases involving a white male perpetrator in which the victim was a black male was 0.87%. It was 6.25% when the victim was a black female. It was 3.08% when the victim was a white male, and it was 4.04% when the victim was a white female. The data shows that a black male convicted of killing a white female is 29.9 times more likely to be sentenced to death than when a black male kills a black male, and is 10.8 times more likely to be sentenced to death than when a black male kills a black female. In general, the chances of receiving the death penalty is greater when the victim is white. This reveals a racial bias in the application of capital punishment. Either argument, faulty practice or having a disproportionate impact on the likelihood of receiving capital punishment, provides sufficient ground for abolishing capital punishment in the state of Louisiana. I understand why capital punishment invokes so much emotion. The crimes that trigger capital punishment rightfully cause revulsion in society. Nevertheless, for the reasons I have indicated, the prospects of executing an innocent person and the quantifiably racially skewed application of capital punishment proves that capital punishment is an antiquated flawed, and unjustifiable practice that should be abolished. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Our next group up is Mr. Lemoyne, Mr. Trinacosta, and Mr. Dixon, please. Thank you, gentlemen. As they take a seat, Mr. Dixon is turned in a white card. He's the Louisiana Public Defender. Mr. Trinacosta will introduce himself, and Mr. Lemoyne will. So, Mr. Trinacosta, introduce yourself.
Hi, Nick Trinacosta.
And you're going to address the numbers a bit for us?
I'm going to address the numbers, but I would like Mr. Dixon to go first, and I would go second, and Mr. Lemoyne third, if that's okay with the chair.
That works fine. That's the order I called him in, I think. So,
right.
Mr. Dixon, what do you have to offer to help us with the conversation?
All right, James Dixon from Louisiana Public Defender Board. I'm here to discuss essentially financials and the financial aspect of this issue. First, I'd like to point out there seems to be a misconception amongst many that the cost of incarcerating someone for life is more expensive than the death penalty. Studies have been done throughout the United States that prove that it is actually the opposite is true. The studies that have been done show that it actually per case, on average, it can be anywhere from $500,000 to $1.5 million on average per case when you compare the two. So when I talk about the cost of the death penalty, it's important to understand what I cannot tell you about. I do not have data on what it costs the prosecution, both in their legal fees, their experts, their investigation. I cannot tell you what it costs the court with respect to the cost of the trial itself, putting up jurors, especially when you have a change of venue, what it costs to feed them. I have none of those figures. So those are absent here, and they are substantial. I also don't have the figures of individual districts that have death penalty programs. This is just what the Louisiana Public Defender Board has spent since its inception. And since 2008, the Louisiana Public Defender Board, through last fiscal year, has spent $103,700,688. By the time we get through this fiscal year, we will have spent $111 million on the death penalty. So, what you need to understand is, what are we getting for that? So, since 2008, there has been exactly one execution. So we will have spent by the end of the year $111 million for one execution. And I would suggest that as policies go, that's rather ineffective. So the question we have to ask is the policy of the death penalty compatible with the concept of limited government? Well, it is not. And so you have to ask the question, is our suspicion of the government's ability to carry out this function have a valid basis? And well, it does. The reversal rate since 2000 death penalty cases is well over 90%. We are not. This is not a function that works adequately. You also need to understand that someone who's on death row is, since 2000, is 3 times more likely to be exonerated than executed. I mean, let that sink in for a second. So you're much more likely to be freed than executed if you're on death row. And you have heard in detail the problems with the racial component of this. So the next question you ask is this policy prohibitively expensive? I think the $111 million per execution speaks for itself. And finally, does the death penalty achieve its goal? Well, if the purpose is to, in fact, punish those who commit murder by imposing the ultimate penalty, that is the imposition of the death penalty. As there's only been one, I think it's pretty safe to say this does not achieve its goal. But those are the numbers from just the Louisiana Public Defender Board's perspective, and that is money that has been we cannot get back and could have been used to better use. I would suggest.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. And just as one caveat on the one execution that we've had for the $111 million, that was essentially a volunteer.
Yes, sir. It was somebody who waived their appeals, and so it was voluntary.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Trinacosta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and address you on this matter. For the past 30 years, I've represented persons facing the death penalty almost exclusively in my practice in all stages of death penalty cases. I have studied the death penalty. I maintain a database. I know of every death sentence issued in the state and the outcome of every one. And I'm here to present those figures to you. But my hope is that I can offer some insights into this historical data to illuminate the most important question you have, and that is, what are the benefits of the death penalty? We've already heard some bad things about the death penalty. I'm going to give you some more bad things about the death penalty. So then the question is, what are the benefits, and how do they, or do they, come close to weighing on the negatives? You know, it seems to me, and I say this to juries all the time when I'm trying a death penalty case, everyone on the jury is in favor of the death penalty or they wouldn't be sitting there. That doesn't mean you have to kill, but more important, it doesn't mean that that's the policy you need to keep pursuing. The 40-year history that we have in the modern day era shows that death penalty is dysfunctional. And more than that, it is so arbitrary to be ridiculous in that who gets sentenced to death is the roll of a dice in this state, but who gets executed is even farther out. We've had 243 death sentences in this state since the death penalty was reenacted in 1977. We have today 66 persons on death row. Now, 2 years ago when I testified before this committee, we had 73 people on death row. What happened? The cases got reversed. I'll illuminate that a little bit more. As you've already heard, we have 11 people exonerated, which is the most in the country per capita. Let it be known loud and clear, DNA only factored into one case. DNA is rare in criminal cases. So I heard a representative last year say, well, we're over the exoneration period because now we have DNA science. Well, none of these individuals were exonerated with DNA except one that played a part in the case. 10 persons have died of natural causes on death row. Their heartbeat stopped when God called them home. There have been, and these I think are the most important figures we have, when we have an 85% reversal rate of all resolved cases. So let's take resolved cases. Number one, executions, 28 of them. Those are resolved. The other resolved cases are when a constitutional error has been found and the death sentence or the conviction is reversed. And the prosecutor does not seek the death penalty again, so it's a permanent removal from death row. That would be 136 reversals. 85% reversal rate. Think about, 2 years ago when I was here, it was an 83% reversal rate. And trust me, we're not talking about the Louisiana Supreme Court willy-nilly overturning death sentences. These are serious constitutional errors that show, that implicate the fairness in the trials. We have the highest reversal rate in the country. So if we have 66 people on death row and we have an 85% reversal rate, statistically speaking, 59 of the persons on death row today will be permanently removed from death row to serve out a life sentence. And 7 will be executed. That's just based upon the statistical model. We haven't had a case in Louisiana where a court has found a constitutional problem with the statute that all of a sudden wiped out 30 death sentences. These are individual reversals, which of course include prosecutorial misconduct. It is the second leading cause of death case reversals, where prosecutors engage in misconduct. Of the 66 persons on death row, 1 is a woman. 44 are African Americans. That would be 66%. 18 are Caucasians. That would be 27%. And 4 are Hispanic, 6%. Doesn't seem to mirror the population of the state. No one has or is here to suggest that African American people commit murder more than white people. But what the fact is, prosecutors decide who to seek the death penalty on. I had a prosecutor in Terrebonne Parish tell me, I'm going to get a death sentence on your client. I said, it's not possible. He didn't kill anybody. She said, oh yeah, I'm going to get a jury from South Lafourche. That's where it was, Lafourche. From South Lafourche. I said, why? She said, they hate Mexicans. We didn't try the case as a death penalty case, but that is the sentiment among prosecutors in this state. It was mentioned, but I want you all to be very clear on this. 28 executions. Do we feel any safer? Now, 20 of those 28 were executed between 1983 and 1992. 9 years, we saw 20 people executed. Crime rate didn't go down, not at all. There was no deterrent effect on people committing heinous murders in this state when that happened. We have had 2 executions in the last 19 years. Now just think about this for a minute, Senator White. We've had 2 executions in 19 years, but our crime rate is the same. You know, it's like, are we worse off or better off? Or I address it to you because 2 years ago we had a little conversation about this. So we really haven't gotten anywhere close to having a system that helps us, if you understand what I mean. 8 executions in the last 29 years.
Mr. Trinicosta, I'm going to hold you at this point because I'm trying to follow our time constraints.
No problem.
I appreciate the stats that you've brought. I'm going to now ask Mr. Lemoyne to visit with us for a moment. Mr. Lemoyne, introduce yourself, and how many death penalty cases have you represented people in?
I'm Stephen Lemoyne. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in New Orleans. I've represented approximately 35 people in capital prosecutions. I have had 8 full capital trials, 2 verdict.
And the question I pose to you is the question about deterrence, and that it's easy for us to postulate from sitting over here, never having done that position that you've had or Mr. Trinicosta has had. In your experience, as a death penalty act as a deterrent at all to any of the people that you've represented?
Absolutely not. And let me explain why. When I was a senior at a Catholic high school in Denver, Colorado, I was standing next to my mother washing dishes back in the days before automatic dishwashers. And she said to me kind of out of the blue, which may be a very good way to make an impression on one's children, by the way. She said kind of out of the blue, you know, these people who commit murders have had something happen to them. There is something the matter with them that is the result of the lives that have been inflicted upon them in most cases. And I didn't really know what she meant, but I never forgot what she said. And as I have represented the many people that I've represented, all of whom I must say I have cared about, not just because I'm supposed to, but because I care about them as human beings. As I have represented these people, I have found that what my mother, who was a high school graduate from Hoxie, Arkansas, and who intuitively knew this thing that she told me about, and which has guided my life to a great degree, what she was talking about I found to be true. And that is, all of the people that I have represented, particularly people that I've gone to trial with, have had things happen to them in their lives that have damaged them, or they have been impaired in substantial ways so that they are damaged in that way. And, of course, deterrence is one of those human thoughts that is, I suppose, the result of a misapplication of the scientific method. That is, if you believe that people will abstain from bad behavior if there is a punishment out there that they will receive as a result of that bad behavior, then you might logically believe in the application of the death penalty. But in fact, it is not the case. None of the people whom I have represented, particularly the people that I've gone to trial with, are people who are anything other than highly damaged and highly impaired, people who did not understand the connection between many of their actions and what might happen to them in the future, particularly the imposition of the death penalty. And that connection to me is so inevitable. It is just absolutely true. It is just always true across the board. And people ask me when I go to parties and they find out what I do, well, how can you represent these people who do these horrible things? Because they're not horrible people, they're people. They're people to whom bad things have happened. They're people who didn't have very good raw material to begin with. They're people whose lives, even in their own minds, whose lives were really not worth saving. So they made no calculation whatsoever having to do with the death penalty and likely even the possibility of going to jail. There is no deterrent effect on these people. The people on whom there is a deterrent effect, or would be a deterrent effect, by the existence and application of the death penalty, that is, people like us, right? People sitting in this room, people who have good raw material, people who have had good and loving families to grow up in. Those people don't end up in that situation where the deterrence of the death penalty is enough. Instead, they have the deterrence of moral guidance. They have the deterrence of understanding the difference between right and wrong. And that's why there is, in my mind, and I am not erudite like Mr. Dixon and Mr. Trinacosta. I'm just a lawyer who works in the trenches, and I believe I understand the same thing that my mother intuitively understood. The conduct that they manifest comes from some place that is far beyond the reach of really an esoteric and unfair penalty such as the death penalty in our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lemoyne. Senator White's going to have a question or an amendment. We have one more witness, Senator White, that I want to call, and then can we go to your question or amendment? Or do you need it ready? All right, sure. So Senator White has a question for someone at the table.
I have to answer you. Nowhere in paragraph C of first degree murder does it say that we shall deter. It says we shall be punished. Yeah. And that's what the statute does. And that's what this body votes on. We give the district attorney broad latitude of whether to even pursue the death penalty. And the crime has to fit it. And there's a narrow scope of what fits the crime. In the commission of another felony, law enforcement officer, I've personally seen 2 law enforcement officers set up and shot. One of them behind the head and one of them with a shotgun blast when they brought him to his house through his badge. I didn't convict them. I didn't punish them. But it's my job to set the laws of the state of Louisiana. And nowhere in here does it say deter, as you said. It's punish.
I agree.
And it is a punishment. Whether you agree with that or not, it's a punishment. And I understand the laws of the United States and the state of Louisiana. We were built on, we would rather let 100 men guilty go free than to convict one person wrongly. And I believe that. But I can't, or this body can't, judge every case on every person. We set the guidelines and the laws of the state of Louisiana. So I want you to understand that's where I come from.
Understood. May I respond?
Sure, I don't care.
We used to have in this state at any given moment 100 first-degree murder indictments. That is, a grand jury has determined that there's probable cause for all the elements of first-degree murder. Okay? District attorneys decide who to take to trial on first-degree murder or the death penalty.
But they have to meet the criteria that this body sets
But the
forth.
grand jury has made that determination with the indictment that the elements of first-degree murder are probably there. Okay? My point is that most district attorneys today are not seeking the death penalty.
I understand
Like
that.
they used to 30 years ago or 25 years ago.
And we set new criteria and we set new guidelines.
Actually not. There's only been a few tweaks.
But there are
in
new
the-
tweaks, and I think there's
in
more
the
conscience to it. And I don't deny that maybe some DAs made a wrong decision, whether it be personal or any other reason. Those are things that are out of our control. We set the law. We don't set the mood of the district attorney or the jury or how they follow the law. We can only do what we can do.
Thank you, Senator White. Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Sheaf, if I'm pronouncing this right. You can come to the table, but thank you, Mr. Lemoyne.
Welcome, Senator Claitor.
Thank you.
Have a seat. Sir, would you introduce yourself? I believe you filled out a white card. I don't have it.
Yes.
For information purposes.
I'm Dr. Peter Scharf from the LSU School of Public Health. I started working in corrections in 1970 when Nixon was president. That's been a while. I've testified for the House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives 4 times. I've worked in law enforcement in 15 states and corrections in a dozen. I wrote a book, Badge and the Bullet, about police deadly force, and I'm very sensitive to probably both sides of the issues. And what I wanted to do today was lay out the best research we have on this very important and complex issue. And I outlined 5 areas that I think are important and I'd like to discuss. And I have a handout I'll hand out after I finish. The first is the issue, and Senator Claitor mentioned it as one of the critical issues, and I understand the arguments you made about desert versus deterrence. But the question of what does the research say about the ability of the death penalty to deter murder? And the evidence is very complex and depends in great part on the methodology used. Some studies use state-by-state comparisons. Others use time series. What happens when you introduce the death penalty or it's abolished? But the overwhelming consensus that in the best controlled studies, it's hard to prove that there really is a deterrent effect for capital punishment. The large number of criminologists, such as myself, doubt that level of proof. In the 17th century, Beccaria, Caesar Beccaria was a philosopher, and he said, deterrence is a function of extent of punishment, certainty, and time. Because of the long duration of time between the imposition of a sentence and carrying it out, and also the uncertainty. This is an extremely rare event in a criminal career, that the deterrent effect cannot be expected from theory, nor is it evident in the studies reviewed by the national commissions that have looked at this. The second issue I think to consider, the committee should consider, is the issue of error. What is the false positive, if you want to call it that, error rate in death sentences? And the best studies I've reviewed show that of the 1,470 cases since capital punishment was reinstated with Gilmore in 1976, roughly 40 or 2.7%, there's substantial doubts. And the work that the Innocence Project, Barry Scheck and others have done, I think illustrates the doubt in some of these cases. And this I think creates a philosophic as well as a practical issue. First of all, how do you verify that error rate? It's very difficult to do that scientifically. But then morally, if there's an error, a possibility of error in the carrying out of an execution, what are the ethical consequences of that? And I think we'd all agree that's a critical issue. The third issue, I think, is the issue of race and capital punishment. And this goes back to the McCreskey case. Tim Ford, a friend of mine, a lawyer friend, argued that case before in the Supreme Court. And the question nationally, about 34% of people on death row are African American. In this state, 44 of 66, or about 70%. And again, the disproportionality between 2 and 3 times, I think, is an important issue. This issue of disproportionality is most extreme when you look at the race of the victims, not the accused. So the probability of a black male killing another black male compared to a white female is about a 12-to-1 disproportionality. So you're far more likely to be accused of or convicted of a capital offense, special circumstances case, if the victim is Caucasian, especially if she's female. So that issue is, I think, something that haunts this whole dilemma and creates both scientific as well as ethical issues. The area that I think we're doing research in at LSU School of Public Health, I have a student who's studying severe mental illness in LA, within LA DPS&C, and I've worked on 5 different projects in the last 3 years with LADPS&C, and one on co-occurring disorders. And the issue of, first of all, what is the rate of mental illness, but also manic depression, schizophrenia, all of the different types. They differ by proportions. But the best evidence we have is between 4 and 6% of the people on death row and also within corrections generally are what we call severely mentally ill. And the constitutional prohibitions against executing people who are severely mentally ill, no matter what the form of mental illness, create a moral obligation, I think, that should inform this debate. The last issue that, again, and we have quite a bit of data, and I'm going to give you a down payment with this handout, but the issue of the cost of capital punishment. And this is a widely misunderstood issue. The studies I've read indicate that a death penalty case costs about $700,000 more than a life without possibility of parole outcome to a homicide. But the best that we have new models to calculate cost benefits, and I worked with Rhett Covington and Secretary LeBlanc, Secretary Covington and Secretary LeBlanc on that here in Louisiana. And a lot of the models don't include court costs, prosecution costs, family costs, a variety of costs that need to be considered in this debate. So again, I hope this is helpful in providing some factual context to the important discussions the committee is involved in. I have quite a bit of evidence that underneath this particular fact set, brief fact set that I'll present in a second, and then and I would be honored through LSU to get that information to the committee as we go forward.
All right. So if you would, I think we've received a lot of information on points 2 through 5, but on number 1, deterrence, if I got you right, you said it's complex and depends on the methodology. Do you have a conclusion as it relates to deterrence?
Yeah, there's well, at a low level of the deployment of capital punishment, when it becomes a rarer and rarer event, you go back to Beccaria, and it's the certainty of punishment. And right now, it's like getting hit by lightning, for even within the universe of murderers. So they're given the uncertainty and a length of time, 10 years in some states, there's virtually no deterrent effect. And I think the empirical evidence supports that, Senator Claitor.
All right, thank you. Members, I think we are about given the opportunity to all that wanted to speak. As proponents, we went a little bit over, so it's going to be an hour to the opponents at this point if they need an hour or so.
Can I note just that there's been a letter I've received to Chairman Mack, and it's from experts in criminal justice in the state, and I'd like to offer that as information.
That's part of the record, and we've circulated it, and we have it. Thank you very much, Professor. All right, so I'm just going to run through the green cards real quick as far as those who've spoken, then I'm going to turn to the red cards. Nick Trinacosta, James Dixon, Rob Tasman, Dr. Mitchell, those in favor of the bill, Dan Coots, Melissa Forney, Suhitra Sopate, Devontae Lewis, Katie Caldwell, Ann Steyer, Ms. Harding, Will Harrell, John Burkhart, Kelly Garrett, Schilling, Angela Atkins, Rodney Braxton, Mary Patricia Ray, Ryan Haney, Mr. Chico Yancey, Terry Landry Jr., and Steve Lemoyne. Okay, and as to those that are opposing, let me kind of sort out the cards and see the order that we're going to present them in. And if you wish to speak and you haven't filled out a card, you can approach and grab one of the cards and we can go from there. At this time, I would like to call Mr. Daniel Lanford, Mr. Perry Nicosi, and my classmate and friend, Scott Perlew. Yeah, pass it. And if y'all can choose amongst yourselves what order you want to go in, I would suggest that Mr. Perilou go first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Scott Perilou, I'm the District Attorney for the 21st Judicial District, which is parishes of Livingston, Tangipahoa, and St. Helena. I've been the District Attorney there since 1997. You know, this is a topic that has a lot of debate and discussion, and it always brings it out. I can make a lot of comments and address a lot of issues. I will agree with some of the things that some of the proponents of the supporters of the bill said. Mr. Trinacosta said that the application of the death penalty has changed in the last 20 years. I would agree with that. I sought the death penalty in cases in the late 1990s, early 2000s that I would not even consider. I would not even give it quick consideration, or I would give it very quick consideration. Domestic type murders, double homicides now that, for a lot of reasons, we don't think are death penalty cases. The comment he made about a district attorney saying about the makeup of the jury, I hope that didn't happen. I can't dispute that it did. That's just inappropriate for a DA or an assistant DA to make a comment like that about a pending case, any pending case. And I would suggest to you that that's not the norm or the practice out there practically. Yeah, and we heard a lot of discussion about the deterring factor. I have never prosecuted a murder case or a death penalty case thinking about what the deterrence effect or impact would be. That has to speak for itself in one way or another. But what we do consider is victims and what victims consider to be justice and what a just outcome would be. I've had 2 capital verdicts. Actually 3. The last individual to be executed was Gerald Borderline, which was a Livingston Parish case. 2 of the others have been reversed. One was reversed for what I could not understand the reason why. The most recent was reversed, and the reason cited was prosecutorial. I wouldn't say misconduct, but we were accused of not turning over documents that were considered to be Brady under the law and should have been. I would suggest to you this, that because of the efforts of guys like Mr. Trinacosta, because of the efforts of this legislature, with the funding of capital offenses, the defense of capital cases rather, and the appellate review of those cases, that the system currently works. It works very well, I would suggest to you. I was on an LPB death penalty discussion panel. I wasn't on the panel, I was in the audience last week. I see several people who were there in the audience today. There was a young man sitting behind me who had been exonerated. He had been sentenced to death in Orleans Parish, and he spent some time, I think, on death row, and his case was ultimately reversed. What hit me as ironic about that is if that young man was convicted of second-degree murder and received a life sentence, or if he was convicted of manslaughter and received a 40-year sentence or a lengthy sentence, more than likely, and I don't know, I'd like to know what Mr. Trinacosta and some of the guys that have been doing long-term criminal defense think about this, but in my opinion, more than likely, that individual, that young man would still be in prison and would be there a long time. But because his case was a capital verdict, it received a lot of scrutiny, and it received a lot of effort by lawyers and experts, and ultimately his case was reversed. That's just an irony in the system. The flip side of that is the case I mentioned earlier that was reversed 2 years ago by the Supreme Court. It was reversed without argument. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed our decision without argument, did not allow us a chance to argue, and basically said there were some documents that we should have turned over, and some other issues with respect to prosecutorial conduct. There was a dissent by Justice Alito. The case was reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court. I only bring it up because ultimately that same defendant pled guilty. He pled guilty to the same factual basis of participating in running over a young 16-year-old boy in Livingston Parish, to the point where his mother went to the morgue to identify him. She looked at him and said, "That's not my son." The friend with her said, "You need to look again." She looked again and saw and recognized his tennis shoes and said, "Okay, that's my son." The same case that was reversed, they would count that as a reversal. And it's a reversal. That defendant pled guilty to the same factual basis that he was ultimately given the death penalty by a Livingston Parish jury. So the exonerations, that term is thrown around. I don't know if that's factually innocent or not. There's a big difference, and there's a big difference between a reversal and somebody like Michael Weary, who pled guilty to the same factual basis that he was charged with originally. So I would suggest to you that appellate review in capital cases, it works. Maybe it works, doesn't bring about a just result, but it works, and that's a credit to the effort of the guys that testified up here earlier. We recognize that's part of the system. But death penalty cases, as Mr. Trinacosta said, I submit, are down. We as prosecutors, at least I can only speak for myself, I guess, but it takes a lot of shocking conduct, not just the criteria of the first-degree murder statute, but it takes a tough case for us to accept it as a death penalty case. But I'll finish up with this. What are we going to do when there's such a shocking event, like someone walking into a church and a mass shooting and killing innocent people in a church? What are we going to do? What are we going to tell the public? What kind of confidence are they going to have in the system when cases like that happen? Or someone runs a truckload of explosives into a daycare center and innocent children are killed. What are we going to do when that happens in Louisiana and we tell them it's life in prison? And by the way, in the last 2 years, I think it's 53 people have been released from Angola who have been sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that we used to tell people they will never get out of jail. They won't get out of prison. The only way they can get out of jail is if the governor commutes a sentence. That's what we used to tell victims. We don't do that anymore. It's a different game out there. So I'm open to questions, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Mr. D.A. Perilou. He does a great job at what he does, gives a good voice to the victims, and I don't want any of those watching or participating here to think that we have somehow forgotten about the victims. We're very cognizant of that, but I will certainly agree that Mr. Perilou is a strong voice for the victims and appreciate your contribution to the discussion today. Mr. Perry Nicosa?
Correct.
Yes, sir.
Hi, how are you? Good morning.
Good.
Perry Nicosia, District Attorney at the 34th JDC, which is in St. Bernard Parish. Been the District Attorney since 2015. They consider me and a couple of the guys the younger, newer DAs. And I was a judge before I was a District Attorney for about 5 years. Sat on a couple of trials as a judge and actually sentenced someone to life in prison for rape. And until you do that, you don't quite understand the significance of what that jury goes through and the thought process when you think about putting someone in jail for life. And I say that only to bring up what it must be like to be on a jury to put someone to death and how horrific and the sentiment it must be. I take that seriously now that I'm a prosecutor, so I've seen it from the bench side and from the prosecutor, and now I've sit in front of victims. And recently, while unlike Mr. Perilou being fairly new on the job, I have not had a capital case in St. Bernard Parish and hope I never will. But the idea that that is available for a horrific event, such as Mr. Perilou said, if there was a church shooting or school shooting, I had a case that gave me some consideration for capital defense, and I want you all to understand the thought process of myself and other DAs. This is a topic we commonly, routinely discuss. A gentleman hid under his wife's house, ex-wife, former wife's house, with an axe and attacked her to the point of just about trying to cut her head off. And I had to sit with the family. I had to sit with the mother who witnessed the event. I had to sit with the sister. And you can imagine having to watch that. They wanted the death penalty. And the decision I had to make as I sat there was to what extent and where do we go with the death penalty, the money it would cost, what the defense would be, how long it would take. I explained the situation currently in Louisiana, how many people were on death row. I explained the appellate process and how long it would take. And I made the decision not to go forward with the death penalty in that particular case. He pled guilty to life, and that's where he is. But if it would be more horrific, and I hope I never face that Mr. Perilou had to face some of those decisions, I want y'all to consider the victims. I want y'all to think about some of these horrific events. And it would take an extreme, horrific circumstance I think for any DA currently, as we posture ourselves in the way we take our jobs as seriously as we do. I can't speak for the 70s and the 80s and some of the things that were done, and I hope we've all moved past a lot of those stories that we've heard some examples of. And I think as a country and a state and a society, things are getting better. And I think now, as we move forward, I'd like to think some of those old prosecutorial misconduct statements are a thing of the past. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nkosi. And again, we as a committee and the legislature appreciate the hard work that you guys do as prosecutors. That's not easy. It's easy for people to sit back and second guess you from out there never being in the arena. It's tough, hard work that you do, and we appreciate it. Thank you very much. Mr. Lanford, introduce yourself and tell us what you want to tell us.
Hi, my name is Daniel Lamford. I work as a legislative aide for Senator Milkovich, and just until Thursday when his other aide comes back. And I am in favor of a death penalty for serious murderers, and I really appreciate what the gentleman next to me said. I can tell they have a lot of experience, and they speak from experience, and I'm just speaking from a little bit of research I've done. So first of all, as a Christian, I support the death penalty. First of all, I want to say, though, the punishment needs to be proportional to the crime. So if someone just steals something from a store or lies about something, I wouldn't have the government give them the death penalty for that. But for serious murderers, that's when the death penty needs to happen. But first of all,
excuse me, Daniel, 1 second. I'm going to let you continue, but gentlemen, if y'all would like to give up your chair, Dr. Hall can come forward. He's indicated he would like to speak. You still want to speak, Dr. Hall? All right, come forward, Dr. Hall. And if there are any others that filled out a red card and would like to speak, all right. Have a seat, Dr. Hall, and continue, Daniel, if you have more to tell us.
Yes, sir. So first of all, my position is thoroughly biblical. It starts with the book of Genesis. Genesis 9:6 says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." Exodus 21:12 says, "Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death." And then we see even in the New Testament, it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." And I'll skip a little bit. It says, "For rulers are not a terror to good judgment, but to bad." Then, "Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you shall receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because he does not bear the sword in vain."
Daniel, we appreciate that. Do you,
I'm sorry, do I need to wrap it up?
Please.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, almost done. Okay, so I also read that the death penalty has a strong deterrent effect on crime. And among economists, capital punishment definitely deters murders. And so, okay, I'll just tell you this one statistic, okay? There are 18,000... Further research analysis revealed that each execution seems to be associated with 71 fewer murders in the year this particular execution took place. And that's by Michael Summers with a PhD and MBA. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Daniel, for participating in the process. Dr. Hall, introduce yourself. We've met you before, and you've actually prayed for us as we've started session and other days. So introduce yourself and tell us what you
Dr.
need to
Will
know.
Hall, and I represent Louisiana Baptists, about 500,000 baptized adults, and 1,650 churches. And I would just add just a couple things to what the young man said. What he did leave out is that death, as authorized in the Scripture, is upon the testimony of 2 or 3 eyewitnesses, which is a pretty stringent standard for applying the death penalty. And I believe that as you look at the death penalty in this state, as you look at other tweaks that you make to the law, increasing that kind of scrutiny would improve, I think, both on the areas of cost that were brought up and also the areas of inequality, which I do believe exist in our system right now. And I do believe that what Senator White said is true, that sometimes punishment is just for punishment. As I look at some of the mass murders that we've had in the United States recently, the multiple deaths in Pittsburgh at the synagogue, the multiple deaths at First Baptist Sutherland Springs, just across the border in Texas, the recent single death at the synagogue in Poway, California. I do believe that you look at the deaths at the elementary school children in Sandy Hook in New York. There are times where just punishment is what is appropriate, not a deterrent. But I would offer this one thing about deterrence and the death penalty, and it's a military example. I think I've shared before that I'm a retired naval aviator and something of a military historian. I directed all the academic programs for leadership development at the Naval Academy, and this is one of the leadership examples we gave them, and that's the execution of Private Eddie Slovic. And not many people remember, but in 1944, the U.S. forces in Europe were facing an extraordinary number of desertions. In fact, military leaders thought that it was crippling our effort, and especially the Germans were having a particular effectiveness in their offensive in the Ardennes. A young private named Eddie Slovic deserted, and he asked for clemency, but General Eisenhower instead went with the military board's recommendation for execution. And this is how they conducted it. They required a non-commissioned officer from every unit in the European theater to be present. Eddie Slovic was executed by a firing squad, and then the non-commissioned officers were instructed to go back to their units and let people know what had happened. And desertions after that execution of Eddie Slovic, which I think was the first execution for desertion since the Civil War, they say resulted in a dramatic drop in the desertions from that point forward. So I do believe that there is that execution can serve as a tool, one, as just for punishment, that it can serve as a tool as deterrence. And I do believe that it all comes down to what you are doing here in this committee in terms of narrowing the focus and increasing the standard for applying the death penalty in the state of Louisiana.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. So we've had Scott Perilou, Perry Nicosi, Dr. Hall. It's been brought to my attention that we probably need to strike Daniel Lanford's testimony from the record, that it's not allowed by our rules. I don't think it was an intentional violation, but it's just not allowed by our rules, so we're going to strike his testimony. We also have red cards from Louisiana District Attorneys Association, Mike Barnett, Mike Renatza, which is the Executive Director of the Louisiana Sheriff's Association, Gary Bennett, Louisiana Sheriff's Association, Shannon Dearman, Louisiana Sheriff's Association, Johnny Koch, Kevin Hayes, Pete Adams, Louisiana District Attorneys Association, Kathleen Benfield, Jamie Johnson, Anna Joy Lanford, Connie Lanford, Jonathan Lanford, Sarah Lanford, and Rachel Lanford. I'm following up on Daniel's testimony. He's a student worker, and under our rules, he's not allowed. So there's nothing wrong with his testimony or what he's testifying to. It's just not allowed under our rules. I'm going to waive my close. I see Senator Colon has a motion. Senator Colon.
I was moving favorably as amended.
Okay, Senator Colon has moved favorably as amended. Senator White.
Object.
Senator White objects. So that means we'll have a vote. If you vote yes, you're voting for the bill as amended. If you vote no, you're not voting for the bill as amended. If you call the roll.
Senator Hengens? No. Senator Barrow? Yes. Senator Carter?
Yes.
Yes. Senator Colon? Yes. Senator Mills?
He's not present.
Senator White?
No.
No. You have 3 yeas and 2 nays.
Well, Chairman obviously votes yes, so that's
Yes.
4-2. The bill will be reported as amended. Thank you, members, for being patient, and thank you, audience, for being respectful of one another's views as we went through the process.